Hey, what's going on, everyone? All right, so essentially I wanted to try to make a getting started guide with the E2-M4. And this is primarily focused at people who are coming from the GH5. Is it a formidable documentary camera? Yes, you can make it a formidable documentary camera. Is it as good as the GH5 in that regard? It's a toss-up. Image quality and audio quality-wise, blows the GH5 out of the water. Usability-wise and convenience-wise on the GH5, blows this thing out of the water, right? So you have your trade-offs. It's not necessarily a vertical upgrade. So depending on your use case, it might be either a lateral move, might be kind of taking too many steps backwards, you might get frustrated with it, or you might be like me, and you might actually really appreciate the investment and enjoy the tool and the opportunities that it's now unlocking from a perspective of the gains that you're getting from image quality as well as your post-production efficiency. So the first thing you're gonna wanna do is you want to join the Facebook group. And before you immediately start asking questions in the Facebook group, use the search function in the Facebook group to see if that question has been asked already. And here's a tip. The question has been asked already, okay? So just find the answer first. Not only do you wanna join the Facebook group, you wanna find Peter Van Loo's, basically it's the Zcam handbook. It's essentially a Zcam user Bible, right? Like he has recommendations for batteries. He's been keeping logs of recommendations for CFast cards, SD drives, like everything you need to know to get up and running, to answer all of your questions, go there. That's where I got all my initial recommendations for my CFast cards and for the batteries. When you first get started, it's basically about purchasing the camera and making sure that you have the core components that you need in order to get up and running. The first thing you're going to need is the revolver grip. So the revolver grip really is your first component to make this thing familiar to you from an ergonomic standpoint of operating like a GH5. It expands the usability. It allows you to take what is designed to be a somewhat slow-moving camera for narrative work to a documentary machine, because now you can move really quickly with it. So I've got a review of this. If you want to check it out, you can go right here and watch that. But this is an essential purchase if you're coming from a GH5. Some people will go with V-mount batteries with the excitement of being able to run everything off of a single battery. And that is exciting. However, there is a significant risk in doing that. Now, this risk is not specific to Zcam. It's just the fact that now, because more people are doing it through the Zcam doorway, basically, they tend to sort of point the finger at Zcam, but this isn't a Zcam problem. It just has to do with electronics. Basically, you're risking frying your HDMI port by powering everything from a single battery source. So this problem happens with RE cameras, it happens with RED cameras. It's an electronics issue. It's not specific to Zcam itself. But if you're not turning everything on in a specific sequence, you can overload everything. And there's too many opinions out there about what exactly the specific sequence is. So if you're going to do that, I believe Ari has written an article about what you're supposed to turn on first and what you're supposed to plug in second or whatever. Really, for peace of mind, I've just gone back to just using two batteries, one battery for my monitor, one battery for the camera, and then I don't even have to worry about like risking that to my camera at all. All right, so one thing to be careful of when you're switching from the GH5 is lenses and lens choices. It depends on what your current lens setup looks like. If you're already using a speed booster and you're using Canon glass, then you're in a good situation. You won't have to buy any new lenses. If, however, you are currently using native Micro Four Thirds lenses by Panasonic or Olympus, and you're moving to this camera thinking you're going to save money on those lenses, because you're buying another Micro Four Thirds camera, haha, not so fast. My favorite lens, the Olympus 12-40 f2.8 Pro, doesn't do well on this camera. And what I mean by that is Panasonic and Olympus are basically cheating with that lens. They're correcting all of its flaws with their firmware. And the Zcam just doesn't have that lens profile. So it's distorting horrifically at the corners of the frame. Kind of almost, it's so bad it is distracting, and that was very unfortunate. Also, the thing you're gonna miss is the fact that this doesn't have in-body image stabilization, obviously. The GH5 has incredible IBIS. I've gone on hikes with the GH5 filming handheld, and all the footage comes out super smooth. I will not be able to do that with this camera. But what I need then is image stabilized lenses. So I had to move from native micro four thirds lenses over to a speed booster and Canon glass. So that's just something to think through. The menu system is pretty intuitive, except for two menu items, which is record and video. I feel like both these two menu boxes should be under the same thing. But if you did that, you would only have 8 items instead of 9, and it wouldn't be laid out as beautifully as it currently is. But if you're looking for something and it's not in record, it's probably in video. Now, what do I mean by this? Inside of record is where you find your resolution, right? So your aspect ratio and the resolution that you're filming in, as well as your variable frame rate. So that's what you're gonna be finding ultimately inside the record tab. Inside of the video tab is where you're going to find what you're recording in. So do you want to record in H.265, H.264, ProRes, Z-RAW? That's where you're going to find this stuff. You're also going to be able to turn on the wide dynamic range mode, time lapse here, your low jello mode here. That's what you're going to find in video. So just to quickly help you get a sense of using this camera, if what you think should be in record isn't in that menu, it's gonna be in the video menu, okay? Aside from that, those are really the two confusing parts of this menu system. The menu system itself is actually very intuitive. You only really have nine folders to go into, and it's a lot easier menu system than the GH5 because this tool is designed to do one thing, which is ultimately record video. As you're switching aspect ratios, it works very similar to the GH5S, where it's using different surface areas of your sensor in different aspect ratios. So what I have found is the only 3 aspect ratios that I would actually use, and I actually do use, are the 3696 by 2772. Okay, that's your 4:3 aspect ratio, Cinema 4K, and the Super 16 mode. So ultimately, those would be the 3 that I just regularly use. I wouldn't use the 4K aspect ratio. You're getting the same frame width of the 4K aspect ratio that you do in the 3696 by 2772. It's just when you film in that aspect ratio, you're getting more on top and more on bottom in your frame. And so it just gives you that much more variability to actually use to recompose your image. So I just wouldn't shoot in 4K. Why I would shoot in Cinema 4K over 4K is that you're literally seeing more of the frame when you're in Cinema 4K. You get a little bit more on the right and left, and it allows you that much more flexibility. The Super 16 mode kind of will work very similarly to your ex-tele mode. The only downside is you can't initiate it as quickly as you can with ex-tele modes from your GH5. With the GH5, you just click a button and you can punch into ex-tele and then punch out, and it's just really quick. It's just like, if I'm filming and in the moment, I'm like, I wish I had a little bit more. I would boom, punch in, boom, I've got that little bit more. This doesn't work that way. This basically you enter into Super 16 mode and the camera has to reboot and reset itself, and now you're shooting in Super 16 resolution. And so because of that, you can't use it as quickly. And it's gonna be more of an intentional choice and not of a reactive choice like I was able to have it with the GH5. One thing I was super paranoid about before I got this camera was, how's the audio? Is the audio quality good? Do I need an audio interface? What do I do about recording audio? Because there's too many people having problems with audio with this camera that it's even recommended by Zcam in their user group, don't use phantom-powered microphones, use battery-powered microphones. It gets to the point where you're just like, you know what, just avoid using the XLR and only use the 3.5 millimeter input. But I think that's recommended because their microphone just might not be sensitive enough to work well with the internal preamps of the camera. And that's when this camera starts falling on its face, right? But really it's when just about any camera would fall on its face, right? Is if you're using a microphone that's not that sensitive. Cameras never have great preamps. So whenever you're straining the preamp on your camera, that's not gonna work out too well. Luckily, when I was searching for my on-camera microphone, I was looking for a very highly sensitive microphone. That's why I like the SE7. It's also why I like the Audio-Technica 875R. So the SE7 with this camera sounds good. I don't really have any issues. After doing tests and doing head-to-head tests with the GH5, I've actually found the XLR audio cleaner and it sounds fuller from this camera than the GH5. The professional dedicates himself to mastering technique, not because he believes technique is a substitute for inspiration, but because he wants to be in possession of the full arsenal of skills when inspiration does come. The professional dedicates himself to mastering technique, not because he believes technique is a substitute for inspiration, but because he wants to be in possession of the full arsenal of skills when inspiration does come. But if you want to completely eliminate any risk and any issues, just use the 3.5 millimeter input and it's fine. Metering audio with this camera is real frustrating because your audio clips at -3 dB, not at 0 dB, at -3 dB. And really, I think the limiter starts at about -6 up to -3. So you just have to record your audio softer than you're using. Quieter than you're used to. So because of that, metering your audio and looking at your audio meters are deceptive because if it gets into the yellow, you've basically killed your audio track. So you kind of have to meter down, and that's why I love the fact that it allows you to bracket, is because it gives you this safety net. So when you bracket your audio, just make sure depending on whether you're using the 3.5 millimeter or the XLR, that your input is set to XLR, and then you're gonna scroll down to input gain, and then in input gain, you hit Control, Manual, and then you're going to go to your left gain and your right gain. You can actually set independently. So what I've started doing now is I've found that giving about 6 dB spread between your left and right audio channel is a good enough spread for that, and that I try to keep my audio set to, if I'm in a quiet environment, where there's not a lot of ambient noise and I'm trying to just people are just talking, they're not shouting, they're talking, right? Then I'll keep the audio at 0 dB and -6 dB. If I'm in a louder environment, then I'll move that down to -2 and -8. That's giving me enough of a ceiling so that way I'm not necessarily hitting that -3 clip, right? And then the -8 dB is really giving me enough safety. And I feel like if you keep a spread of about 6 dB between the two channels, that's safe enough. Unless you get into an extremely loud environment, right? Where it's hurting your ears, this should be fine. Monitoring audio, however, I would monitor through your actual monitor. I wouldn't monitor your audio through the camera because it's too freaking loud. Right? It blasts your eardrums out, and you can only, even at its lowest setting, which is 0 dB, it's still too loud, right? So you can't even lower the audio too much. So because of that, I don't monitor from the camera. If I need to monitor my audio, I'll monitor from the monitor. And just another tip, if you're gonna get a monitor, make sure to get a monitor that has really good audio meters, which is why I decided to go with the Atomos Shinobi. I wanted reliable audio meters, so that way I can more precisely meter my audio at that lower level, so I'm not hitting that -3 dB range. Everybody's get the Ninja V, get the Ninja V, get the Ninja V, because they're chasing the fad of ProRes RAW. In my perspective, it's dumb. It's dumb for my use case. So I don't mess with RAW. I went with the Shinobi. The reason I went with the Shinobi is it's lighter weight, doesn't have fan noise, has way better battery life, and it still has all the great like interface and functionality and brightness that the Ninja V has, and it's less money. So you're kind of getting, for my use case, you're getting a significant more value for half the daggum price, which is awesome. One thing that is a great surprise is that this camera has really great rolling shutter performance, even better than the GH5. And since you're going to be using this in a documentary situation, you're often bumping, you're often moving around, you're going handheld, which means that rolling shutter is actually a concern. The footage rarely turns to jelly. So you don't even need to use the low jello mode to make sure that you're getting minimal rolling shutter. This camera already does really great. Also, ISO. So this is a dual native ISO camera. You've got 500 as your base, 2500 as your max. Now, our commercial filmmaker friends and our narrative filmmaker friends will never use anything outside of those two because those help maximize the amount of dynamic range that they're getting out of the image. Being documentary filmmakers, we just like to ride our ISO all the time, and it doesn't really, we don't get to control the lighting of the situations that we're entering into. So just know that the ISO performance of this camera is extremely impressive. I'm able to crank it up to 8,000, 10,000 ISO, really with no problem. The noise on this camera looks more like grain. It's very small. It's not the chunky, blocky color noise that you're used to seeing. It's finely distributed, evenly distributed. It just looks like you're using a higher grain film stock. So really great. I need to do more specific tests, but you can just know in confidence that you can crank this camera up higher than you can with the GH5, and it's not going to deteriorate. Filming with this camera and exposing this camera is different than exposing with the GH5. What I found though is using the Z-Log2 curve is actually simpler to comprehend than using the V-Log L curve. V-Log basically condenses the entire usable, what would you call this? Your usable IRE, your usable luminance levels, right? It bumps up your 0 point up the scale and it knocks down your clipping point down the scale as well. Every time I'm in V-Log, it's like, wait, crap. Where is my stuff clipping at? Where are skin tones? Obviously, I know skin tones are about 65, clipping is about 80, right? But it's confusing, and every time I'm looking at it, it's like, crud, this again, right? This is actually an easier log curve to wrap your mind around because it just boosts your bottom clipping point up a little bit. So 100 is still clipping on this camera. But with this camera, you must overexpose the image by 3 stops in order to get the best possible image out of this camera. If you're exposing this camera 1-to-1, right? So if you're setting middle gray for where it should be on the Z-Log2 curve, you're underexposing your camera. You're gonna get terrible blocky shadows and it's just not gonna be good. So just make sure that you are always exposing the E2-M4 to the right. There's a couple things that you're gonna wanna do in order to make sure that you're properly exposing your camera. Those 2 things are setting your zebras and using a monitor LUT. All right, so for my zebras, I have my zebras set. And so what you do is you go into System, Assist Tools, into Exposure, and I've got my Zebra 1 set at 95. So that lets me know kind of where my specular highlights are. So about 95 IRE, it's almost at clipping, right? So if I'm filming clouds, what I'll do is I'll just make sure that they're just barely touching 95, and then I'll might pull them down either a little bit or just make sure that that's where I'm at. So then I know that my clouds are probably gonna come out with some detail in them, that I'm not totally blasting them out. Then what I do, I've loaded a LUT onto my camera. The easiest way to do this is download the LUT pack from Zcam's website. Now in this LUT pack, you have 2 different types of LUTs. You've got LUTs labeled 64 and you've got LUTs labeled 33. The LUTs labeled 64 are for your editing, right? So that's for actually editing your footage, and you would drop those LUTs on your footage. Though you don't actually have to do that, I recommend that you use the Z-Log color plugin because that is a much easier tool to use than trying to find a specific LUT to drop on. The LUTs that you really want to pay attention to are your 33 LUTs. Now these are monitor LUTs, and there's a specific LUT that I use, which is the Z-Log 2 RGB AX2 -3 exposure LUT. So you need to overexpose your image by 3 stops to be properly exposed. What your monitor LUT does is it pulls down that image 3 stops. So that way, now you're seeing what your image will ultimately look like. So what you want to do is you plug your camera into your computer using your USB-C connection. You want to set the camera to mass storage. You go into the menu, you go to connect, you go to USB, and you go make sure that that is set to mass storage. You'll find your exposure LUT inside of the exposure -3 folder, and you just grab that file and you drag that and place it into the folder structure miscellaneous looks preview. So use that in combination with zebras set at 95. That is basically giving me everything that I need to make sure that my footage looks great. And just keep in mind that even in your monitor, even using the monitor LUT, you still want that final image that you're looking at to look brighter than it really should. If you want the most reliability, go with CFast. Now, dollar to dollar expense, like CFast cards are not more expensive than SD cards. They're really averaging about $1 per gigabyte. It's just the fact that if you're going to be recording in any sort of flavor of ProRes on this camera, those file sizes are larger than the file sizes that I'm used to recording on the GH5. I primarily have been recording at 150 megabits per second. And I'm kind of like, I'm recording primarily in ProRes LT on this camera, and the file sizes are a little over 2 times the file size, right? So even though price-wise, CFast cards are about the same amount of money as the V90 SD cards, you're gonna need more storage out of these things if you're shooting in ProRes. One way of initially saving, I don't know, $40 on your initial investment in the camera is that you can actually offload footage through your camera into your computer. So you don't necessarily need a CFast card reader in order to offload footage. You just plug in the USB-C cable in the back, plug that into your computer, make sure you're set to mass storage, and then you can offload your files that way. You have a lot of function buttons with this camera. And so even your power button, your on-off button, can also be assigned a specific function as well. So you've got 5 functions that you can use on the side of your camera, as well as 3 additional function buttons that can be set on the top of your camera. The function buttons that you set on the top of the camera, though, are limited in the amount of choices. They don't have as many choices as you do on the side, which is fairly disappointing and annoying because it almost just makes them redundant. I have the exposure settings already mapped to the revolver grip, so it kind of now reduces the amount of function buttons that I actually have available to me, which is why I wish they could just expand the amount of functions you can use on top and then also add in the ability to adapt your audio, like adjust your audio inputs. So Kinson Liu, if you're watching this video, because I know that you have watched some of my videos in the past, please make it so that way we can set our audio and adjust audio through a function button. That would just be awesome. Since you have all of these function buttons to use, how exactly do you set them up? So what you're gonna do, go down to System, and then you go to User Button, okay? Once you're in User Button, you can assign the function to all of your individual function buttons. You can shoot high frame rates in 10-bit 422, which you weren't able to do in 4K on the GH5. Those high frame rate 4K options, you were limited to 8-bit. Also, in variable frame rate, your camera still records audio. Now, it records audio a little wonky. It records your audio at the intended frame rate speed that your camera is set to, but it records the video in slow motion, right? So When you're done recording anything in variable frame rate, the audio and the video are not matching up. You will have to speed up or slow down your video footage to properly match with the audio, and then you can readjust from there. But say like if you want to shoot at 48 frames per second, your camera will still record audio if you're shooting in these variable frame rate options, which is pretty nice. I really like this camera. I love the image that I'm getting out of this camera, but coming from the GH5, it does feel very similar to my transition moving from mini DV camcorder to the GH2. This is a different tool. It requires an initial jump start to get used to it, but once you get your bearings, which I'm hoping that this video has helped you to do, it's really simple to use once you figure it out. Hope this was helpful. If you have any questions regarding using this camera as a documentary filmmaking tool, then you can definitely leave them in the comments. If you have any questions about using it not as a documentary filmmaking tool, then do not ask the question. I'm not going to answer it. It's not worth my time. Go on to the Facebook group and ask your question there. I know from my experience of using this as a documentary tool. So if you do have questions, leave them in the comments, or you can find me at Instagram. I'm at McNabb_storytelling. Feel free to send me a DM there. Would love to hear from you guys, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.